Hi, all. A little short lecture to set up our discussion of Hochelaga and the literature that we're reading, looking at the Haudenosaunee Iroquois in the period of the 17th and 18th centuries for the most part, although the film takes us beyond that in a significant fashion. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. This is the territory of the Six Nations, the five nations in this map. It's useful, I think, to recognize that changing pattern. We're going to look at some of those changes in the next few minutes. But I want to step back even further and just remind ourselves of some of the different players in Canadian history. And we're going to get a little snapshot of the important issue of differences here. Certainly in my survey class, 2P01, the introduction to colonial Canadian history, I talk a lot about different Indigenous peoples. And I can't stress that enough. It's not a helpful thing in the colonial era, at least. It's not today either, but certainly if you're going to try to understand colonial history, and you start talking about Indians, or even using politically correct language like Indigenous people, just because you think you ought to, it's not helpful because you won't understand what's going on. To understand what's going on, you really need to spend a lot of time thinking about the particular peoples and noting the fact that these people have different cultures, that they speak different languages, that they have different resource bases, that they have different relationships with each other. All of those factors amount to something that amounts to different histories. And that's really, really important in understanding this story. I think most of you know that the Haudenosaunee are widely regarded as the most important military, diplomatic, and trading peoples in northeastern North America for at least this 200-year period. Certainly we can talk about Anishinaabe people being very important. Certainly we can talk about lots of people in New England and New York states, Algonquian peoples east of the Haudenosaunee. We can talk about the Mi'kmaq and the Abenaki in Nova Scotia and in Maine and in what becomes the United States. But certainly the Haudenosaunee are the largest and certainly the militarily and diplomatically and trade-wise the most significant of those. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's also just useful to think about these different stories and how they affect the broad colonial story. And I'll just begin with this really, really quick story. I tell the story in 2P01, but it's a useful story just for reminding us of those differences. When Champlain arrives in the St. Lawrence River Valley in 1608, 1609, he doesn't really know what's going on. He doesn't really know where he is. He doesn't know who these people are. They do. And that's really, really important to know because what he's doing is he's walking into a pre-existing context. He's walking into a set of historical circumstances. And the particular circumstance that he gets caught up in is the ongoing hostility between Algonquian peoples, primarily in what's now Eastern Canada, the Mi'kmaq, for example, and in New England, the Wampanoag and other Narragansett peoples, Algonquian peoples in what's now New England, and other Algonquian peoples to the west as well, including, they're not Algonquians, the Hurons, they're Iroquois peoples, but again, that kind of broad context of being in long-term diplomatic and sometimes military struggle with these people. The Algonquian peoples of the St. Lawrence River Valley convince Champlain to assist them, to ally with them in their struggles with the Iroquois. And the result of this is, and I'm really cutting a complex story down to something really, really simple, but in 1609, Champlain and some of his men join Algonquian warriors down into Lake Champlain, south of the St. Lawrence River, where they meet a group of Iroquois Mohawk warriors. A battle breaks out, and the Mohawk, who have never seen a gun before, are suddenly faced with, they realize they're in a bad situation, they retreat. That's the beginning of a long period of poor relations between the Iroquois and the French, and the beginning of a military alliance with the Algonquian peoples. That's going to, broadly speaking, define the relationship between Algonquian peoples and in New France, further west, further south, further east, all over the place, and a hostile relationship with the Haudenosaunee peoples. But it's that particularity. If you don't get that, you don't really understand that story. And we always treat We try not to. But in the past, we've always treated Indigenous history as kind of beginning when the colonizers show up. That's because we typically write the history when the documents begin. Parmenter, though, is a really good example of this, that, looking at the archaeological record, looking at oral tradition, looking at all kinds of other interdisciplinary sources allows us to tell a much richer story and to see much more was going on. But it's that particularity of a story, of an ongoing history, that's a really useful thing for us to remember, because it's part of where we're going to go in this story again today. So who are the Haudenosaunee, who are the Mohawk? Well, really, really quickly, they are a cultural group. They speak a common language. They exist largely through central eastern North America, largely from the middle of New York, what is today New York State, over as far as midway along the southern coast of Lake Erie, and extended up into parts of what are now Ontario and parts of what are now Quebec, and we'll come back to that point in a moment. They're largely an agricultural people. They lived in large villages, villages of sometimes up to 6,000-7,000 people. They produced agricultural surpluses. They traded those agricultural surpluses. They were an effective confederacy of different peoples who were able, through combinations of trade, diplomacy, and military actions, to hold a very powerful place in central eastern North America. They're also known for military capacity, although a lot of people point out today that this is in many ways a construction of Western colonial views more than of actual practices. Were they effective as a military force? Absolutely. But to portray them in the way that this illustration does, as a military people, as primarily a savage military people, as they might have said at the time, is misleading, and it certainly ignores everything else about that culture, the arts, the creativity, the efforts at peace that confederacy maintained through its time. So a complex people, but an important and significant and relatively powerful people. So again, back to a map of their territory. This is a map again made in the middle of the 18th century, showing the territory of the Five Nations. You can see it there. It's in that territory between Lake Erie and underneath Lake Ontario. You can also see, though, that Montreal is a long way from there. So why are we dealing with Mohawks in Montreal? Well, that's a complex question. But just quickly, I want to point out another factor here, which is this, that, and Parmenter mentions this, that we know for a fact that there were Iroquoian peoples in the St. Lawrence River Valley prior to Champlain arriving there. Cartier describes meeting Iroquoian peoples at Stadacona, modern-day Quebec, and Hochelaga, modern-day Montreal. In fact, he takes some captures some of them and takes them back to France, which wasn't a great thing to do. But anyhow, we digress quickly. But when Champlain shows up there 70 years later, there's not Iroquoian peoples there. And we know that there's been military pressures. Certainly the Montagnais and the Mi'kmaq have been pushing militarily back against the Iroquois in that territory. But we also know the disease has been running through that area as well. The recorded contact with European colonizers is highlighted by Cartier in the 1530s and Champlain in the early 1600s. But we know European fishing boats have been showing up there for over 100 years at this point in time. So disease is already having an impact in that territory. Quickly point out here, just this map illustrates this, and I'll just in case you happen to be wondering about it, it says here this is the country conquered by the Five Nations. This is the Huron territory. The Huron are an Iroquoian people, but they weren't part of the Confederacy, and they are captured and destroyed by the Iroquois in the 1640s and 1650s. And that's part of our story of why there are Mohawks in Montreal. After the conquest of the Huron, many Huron people were adopted into Iroquoian families and Iroquoian villages. Many of those were in the eastern part of Iroquoian territory, over along the Hudson River, south of Lake Champlain. In the 1670s and 1680s, peace treaties were brokered between the Iroquois and the French. And so that frontier area around Lake Champlain became a relatively peaceful area. It's also, however, in that period that Jesuit missionaries begin to extend their reach into Iroquois territory. And they do convert some of those people. In fact, some of those people that they come in contact with are people brought into Iroquoian families, but are some of those Huron people who had already converted to Christianity. So some of those people move north. And you can see by this map, it's not a long, long distance from Albany in central New York up into Montreal. And so that's where you get that population, fairly large population, of Mohawk Christians living in Jesuit lands south of Montreal. As Parmenter points out to you, by the 1630s and 40s, much of that territory around the Five Nations territory has been vacated through combinations of war and disease. And what that means is this large territory is now available to the Six Nations for military purposes, but most importantly for trade purposes. And what that really means is they're in their control of that territory, that anybody coming down the St. Lawrence River, like the French, has to go through Iroquois-controlled territory to get to the Western countries, to get to the fur trade countries. Similarly, anybody coming from the south, the Dutch and then later the British, has to come up the Hudson River, also through Iroquoian territories to get to the fur trade. So they're really strategically very well placed to control the trade. They also realize that the French and the British, and the Dutch for that matter, are enemies, so they need to play this role of playing those powers off each other as a way to protect themselves. And that becomes a long part of the story of Iroquoian history. To maintain their independence, they need to broker peaces and occasionally warfare with both of these imperial powers. So, it's really useful for us to remember right now that Canada, New France, is part of the French Empire. And to remind ourselves that in the 18th century, this doesn't change much in the 19th century, the French Empire is amongst the most powerful empires in the world. We tend to think of the 18th and 19th century as British-dominated worlds, and there's no doubt about it. The British domination of this period does dominate the 18th century, dominates the North Atlantic world. But the French are very, very powerful, and they control a large swath of territory. That changes in the 7 Years' War, and the British, of course, capture Canada and make it their own. It also means that the relationship between the governing imperial state and indigenous people changes dramatically. The British were pretty good at developing a treaty basis with most of the people that they dealt with, and after the 7 Years' War become even better at it. The French sometimes had engaged in treaty-making processes, but not in the formal negotiated diplomatic mode that the British did. They had agreements, they had understandings, but not treaty relationships. And that means that when the British took over this territory, they kind of assumed the legal basis of the dispossession of indigenous people had already taken place. They believed that the French had effectively done that. So they didn't really enforce any of the kind of treaty provisions that they were doing in what's now the United States and would later do in what's now Upper Canada, Ontario. They didn't do that sort of thing at all. The result is that indigenous people in Quebec in general, but in the people that we're looking at, around the Mohawks around Montreal, existed in a legal void where there was very unclear laws and regulations and negotiations available for Indigenous people. You certainly see this generally in Canadian history, that Indigenous people have a poor ability to press their case in court cases, to enforce treaties and so on. But there's no treaties to look at in Quebec, and therefore most courts just said, well, no, that's just done. You've surrendered your possession hundreds of years ago. That's the end of the story. But I want to take us up to the present day and look at where Indigenous people are still and how they were located. They're located in historic locations from the 17th and 18th centuries. So Montreal in 1700, say, is a tiny little place over here. If you've been to Montreal, if you've been to the old city, you know that little section down by the water. It's tiny by the size of Montreal, of course, today. There are two significant Mohawk settlements both of which are associated with Jesuit missionaries. One is here at Kahnawake, just across the river from near the Lachine Rapids, near the mouth of the Lachine Canal, and another one over here on the north side of the river, of the Ottawa River at that point, at a place called Kanesatake. These are not huge reserves and historically haven't played a particularly significant role in Canadian history as locations of unrest. That changed dramatically in the 1990s when a series of resistance actions took place, particularly at Kanesatake, but also at Kahnawake, in protest against incursions on what Indigenous people claimed was their land. These are significant actions. They continue to have importance, and we continue to think of them today because they're one of the most famous episodes in Indigenous state conflict in Canada. We know the Kanesatake resistance more popularly as the Oka crisis, but it's really critical that you see, as you look at this film and as you read this history, that here is the modern legacy of those stories. That the fact that this empire changes, that these are dislocated people. Many of these people, of course, those people that the Jesuits are bringing back to places like Kahnawake, they're effectively refugees. The relationship between them and their indigenous cultures and their indigenous lands is a mixed and complex one. And it's part of what makes the entire political negotiations, legal negotiations around land and political rights in Quebec a very, very complex issue. Look forward to the discussion later today. Take care. Bye-bye.